And I'm also wanting to welcome some of her family members who are with us. I have a brief intro that Alexa wrote. Alexa grew up in Hanover, the youngest of 4 sisters. The daughter of a recovering Catholic, she was raised lightly Episcopalian, but never really took to church. She first attended the UCUV very intermittently in her teens with her mother Deming, hi Deming, who became a member at that point. At Williams College, Alexa spearheaded the creation of a non-denominational spirituality group, the Bean Sorters, through which she developed a close relationship with her college chaplain, despite not feeling, quote, religious per se. After 10 years of being professionally outdoorsy, working seasonal jobs in outdoor education, farming, and timber framing, Alexa went to UVM to become a nurse practitioner. She is now a primary care provider at Alice Peck Day and lives in the Norwich Hills with her wife Brenda, their 2-year-old daughter Maya, their golden retriever Atticus, and 2 rescue cows. If and when she ever has free time again, Alexa hopes to re-engage with her hobbies, which include tennis, ice hockey, canoeing, hiking, woodworking, and singing in community. She remains a bit agnostic, but very interested in spiritual community. We are thrilled to have Alexa share her story.
Thank you, Joe. Oh, this is very close. All right. Hello, everybody. It's funny not to have you here in this room, but I trust you're out there. When Joe asked me to be the speaker for today's service, she suggested I come up with a talk around the theme of challenges. So my first response was, well, I'm sure everybody's sick of hearing about the challenges of COVID time, right? She said no. She thought you all would really enjoy hearing more about that subject. So I'm going to give it a shot. My apologies if, in fact, you've had plenty of that subject. I never meant to be a primary care provider. I really didn't like science in school. It didn't seem like a fit. But I got excited at the end of college. I got very excited about the concepts of pregnancy and childbirth. It just seemed like the single most magical thing we have on this earth is the ability to physically create another human being. And so I decided that despite my strong dislike of science through my school years, I was meant to be a midwife. Nurse midwives train as nurses first, which I would do through a post-baccalaureate 1-year crash course. And then they spend 2 years studying advanced practice nursing and midwifery. I had classmates from Williams and my high school who had gone to med school, and I silently congratulated myself on having chosen the easier route into medicine. 3 years of grad school, and I didn't have to do a residency thereafter. I could just get straight to seeing patients. What a boon! Well, various twists and turns along the way meant that I eventually found myself graduating with a primary care NP instead of my midwifery degree as planned. Same amount of school, but authorized to provide full primary care. Facing the job market, my prior concept had a decidedly different tone. I didn't get a residency. I had to go straight into practice. I had to practice full primary care. So I started searching. Searching for that first job, it turned out I wasn't eligible for most of what I wanted. I lacked experience. What do you know? A college friend, also a nurse practitioner, told me that an NP, a nurse practitioner, graduates with approximately 7%, that's 0.7, of what they need to practice, of the knowledge they need to practice. I've never been in this role before, but somebody has just entered. Good, somebody's let them in. Okay. So I spent a while at it, trying to find a place. And finally, I hired on with APD, Alice Peck Day, which is exactly where I had wanted to be. I was pregnant at the time, and so my start date as a provider got pushed back and back, about 8 months in the end, various reasons. I did some other work for APD in the meantime, but the long and the short of it is that I started seeing patients on my own as a PCP in May of 2019. It took about 6 months for me to sort of get fully ramped up into being a full primary care provider with our practice, taking call, as well as the daily routines. And so I was sort of fully fledged in November of 2019. And as I started practice, I learned quickly, as we all do, I'm sure, that it was very different. The reality of practice was different from the schooling I had received. And I was told left, right, and center by my MD colleagues, who, mind you, had a residency, that I was entering primary care at a time when the load heaped upon us was an actual impossibility. There was virtually nobody who worked primary care full-time as a 1.0 FTE because it was not something that could be done. All right, buckled down. November 2019, I would see what this was all about. Then came 2020. My mom was in Italy, hi Mom, when the first COVID cases came to light in Europe. Over the phone, I told her that it seemed like a bug you really didn't want to get, and so she should see if she could buy some hand sanitizer. She laughed at herself for getting extra, and she made goodie bags for all her group mates. COVID felt far away, and not us, and we kept going. It was another month before our clinic realized, all at once it seems, this is going to impact us here. Suddenly, we were looking at each other with wide eyes, not sure what to say to encapsulate the bigness of the moment. A little dry-mouthed, so I'm going to have a little water. We gathered in group meetings. That was back when we could meet in groups. The whole clinic got together at lunch every day to discuss the progress. How had the numbers changed? What were we facing? What were the new recommendations from the state? New recommendations came down on about the 12 to 36 hour timeline, and our clinic had to adapt. We had to do things the way we were told. Our medical director, who has practiced at APD for decades, recounted to us as a group the days in his residency in the early 80s in New York. There was a strange new illness at the time that was impacting primarily gay men. And he, Brian Lombardo, was allowed to accept or decline as a resident the care of one such patient. He suited up in a hazmat suit and headed in. He encouraged us to do the same now. So we did. We did all the things. We got fitted for PPE. We trained and rehearsed in donning and doffing. For those of you who don't know, there are very specific orders around how you put on and take off PPE when you're potentially dealing with infectious patients of various sorts. We learned new cleaning routines. We learned which rooms had to be shut down for how many hours based on what patients had presented with in terms of symptoms. We faced a PPE shortage, as I'm sure you all remember. We pulled all the masks from our exam rooms because patients were pocketing them. We set up a separate respiratory clinic in a building we were lucky enough to have sitting empty due to primary care having recently moved from one building to a new building. So our old primary care was sitting there empty. We reinstated it, we reinstalled, we literally carried down exam tables and, chairs and everything, computers, to get that space functional again, and started it up as a respiratory clinic. Here, I think we were extremely lucky. I don't imagine there were too many clinics in the country that could pivot to that as quickly as we could, given the space. We developed protocols for who would go where and how we would, for instance, draw blood without bringing suspected COVID patients up into our lab in the clinic where we were seeing non-COVID patients, non-potential COVID patients. We figured out how we would get a chest x-ray without compromising the whole radiology department or the whole x-ray room for the 3 hours that would be needed to COVID clean it, as it were. The meetings were endless. So while we weren't seeing patients very much in April and May and June, I think we were working harder than we had when we had full patient schedules because we were trying to figure out how we would do this thing. And every clinic was pretty much on its own. There were state guidelines, but we had to figure out how to implement it within our system. Back then, when non-essential work was shut down, even being on the road felt a little scary. I'm sure many of you remember this. the scenes of post-apocalyptic movies sort of flashing through your mind. I took to carrying my nurse practitioner license in my car because I had this vision of being stopped and having to justify why I was out and about. I never was. I spent some days in the hazmat suit down at the respiratory clinic, but I wasn't a primary respiratory clinic person. I mostly was up in the clinic doing telemedicine, or at home doing telemedicine, or once we started seeing patients again, seeing them in person, which now involved a paper mask, a gown, a face shield. It was hard to talk to the regular patients through that, but it was harder to talk to the respiratory patients through not only an N95, which I think most of the country wore, but we, for reasons that now escape me, we used, I can tell you what they were. We used respirators. I mean, N95 is a respirator of sorts, but it's a disposable respirator. We used non-disposable Darth Vader-like masks with a big black thing over your face and then two big purple canisters right here. The patients couldn't understand a word I said in the respiratory clinic. I couldn't really hear them. It was a challenging time. When I was preparing this talk, Alan Shute asked, what did you feel like when you were considering, what if this hits here? What if COVID really comes to the Upper Valley? And I was surprised by the question, but I thought maybe some of you would have a similar perspective. I was surprised by the question because at the time, it didn't feel like an if. It felt clearly like a when. I recall looking around at my colleagues. I'm one of a practice of, at that time, 16 primary care providers, and feeling sure that we would lose someone. Which one? I placed my silent bet. A sea change was coming and we just knew it. It wasn't an if. So we trained up for hospitalist medicine. I think people think a doctor is a doctor, and I'm not a doctor, but the term often gets transferred onto me. But I think people think a medical professional is a medical professional and skills are basically transferable and you've sort of learned it all. It's not the case in modern day medicine. Hospitalist medicine is entirely different than outpatient medicine. And so we 16, 17 primary care providers took shifts to go off to the hospital to learn to run the pumps, the vents, a different computer system entirely. How to simply place an order for an aspirin was difficult for us. Different words. We took crash courses at lunch meetings. It was all new even to my colleagues who were MDs. Many of them had touched some sort of, they all probably had touched some sort of ventilator, perhaps 25 years ago when they were in residency. But those were the predecessors to today's machines. Everything was computerized now, everything was different. Even an IV drip doesn't run the way it did pre-computers. It used to be you set a little ball and watched how fast the drip fell through the line. Now it's all computerized, down to the drips per second, drips per minute. The thinking was that we would lose the workforce in unpredictable ways. Presumably the most acute docs, providers would go first, whether being out for a few weeks because of illness or dying. We were getting emergency dispensation from the state to do things no one in their right mind would allow us to do in average times. So first I trained up with everyone for that plan. And then after a few months, the thinking was that if and when the APD hospitalist team, currently hospitalists, needed to be pulled up to Dartmouth because that team was so diminished, then the APD primary care MDs would go to become APD hospitalists, and the APD nurse practitioners would run primary care. There were 3 of us, so 3 NPs. So 5 months into my career as an NP, as a PCP, the plan was that I'd be running a primary care clinic with 35,000 patients. Sure. Wheels up, here goes. Meanwhile, we were treating patients over the phone. We were treating patients in ways I had just a year earlier explicitly been taught not to. In the 2020s, in the 2000s, you don't give antibiotics willy-nilly. We've come to understand that that was terrible practice. You make sure that they need it. You talk the patient through the fact that not every ear infection needs an antibiotic. You might actually fight it better without one. Antibiotics don't fight viral illnesses, right? These are all talking points that I had spent a lot of time on learning. Now, you called my clinic, you talked to me, and if you had a cough or a sore throat, I went, we'll hit you with some azithromycin. Might help. It was an odd time. On the home front, I had a 1-year-old. I extended my breastfeeding timeline to keep giving her what antibodies I might be making in the event that I were exposed to COVID. I had 2 elderly parents, sorry about the E word, guys, 2 elderly parents who bubbled up with only us, so they could see us, myself, my wife, and Maya, our daughter, and no one else. They're intelligent and self-sufficient people, but they needed a certain amount of care and tending, mostly in the form of getting outdoors for my mom. I had to take her skiing. I also have a molecular biologist for a wife who has served as the biosafety officer in charge of the safety elements, the safety primarily of contagion of all of Dartmouth's 170 biology labs. Well, between all that, no corners would be cut by me. So before I headed home each night, I went into the staff shower with a container of hand sanitizer and double-bagged clean clothes. I stripped off my scrubs, sanitized the gaps up to my elbows, up to my knees, down to my collarbones, up to my hairline. I sanitized my face for a while. Then I took my scrubs and I stuck them in one bag, re-hand sanitized, wiped down the outside of that plastic bag, took a second plastic bag and fully enclosed that, placing it in a different place in the floor so that had there been any COVID on the first plastic bag, had it transferred to the floor, it wouldn't transfer to the exterior plastic bag. I put on my clean clothes and I headed home. And at home I kept a hazmat laundry basket full of those bags for a week and washed them separately from all the rest of our household laundry on weekends. Vaccines changed everything. I was offered one of the earliest shots due to my occasional role in the respiratory clinic. At 38 and basically healthy, I desperately wanted it, and yet I didn't feel I deserved it. I swallowed hard, went to my medical director. He was in his 60s, also healthy, but in his 60s. And I offered it to him. He declined. That was in early December. It was actually the second day that the US had COVID vaccines available that I got my first shot. And it may sound over the top to say it, but as I looked back for this talk, I realized pretty palpably that that is the last day I recall feeling downright scared. It was the day I went and offered that shot to my medical director. I was scared he would take it, but I wanted him to. It all worked out. I was fully vaccinated by mid-January. Nobody else was, except my colleagues. It was another weird reality, how to live in a world where I was still quite interested in protecting my parents, my daughter, my wife, also fairly healthy and in a good age range for all of this, but nonetheless pretty aware, but also feeling some freedom myself. I think it was February when a colleague and we had been doing a weekly dinner at the clinic throughout COVID because we couldn't go anywhere. And so we had either brought or ordered in dinner Wednesday nights throughout the year, almost year, throughout the 8 months we'd been back in the clinic. And one week we said to each other, you know what? We could go out to dinner. And so the two of us walked, I think it was late February, we walked from Alice Peck Day to Salt Hill on the Green in Lebanon. We heard the most wonderful singer-songwriter. It felt like she had been plunked there right for us. She was straight out of the 90s, singing covers of all the folk singer-songwriters from the 90s. We requested individual songs. She knew them all. It was magical. But it was also weird. And I didn't go out to eat again for, I think, 3 months thereafter. We're 16 months in. At APD, we haven't lost anyone. Providers, staff of 500. We haven't even had a case with APD transmission, as far as we know. We've been extremely lucky. Colleagues elsewhere tell a very different story. I'm in a Facebook group for providers to discuss COVID things. nationwide. The stories I hear out of Seattle and New York and now the South and the Midwest are unbelievable. Hard to imagine. It absolutely pales our experience of having to have some extra meetings and having to wear some extra PPE and sweat a little bit more in front of our patients. That said, I tell my patients that trauma is trauma, regardless of whether someone else has gone through a greater trauma. The basic survival brain doesn't compute in shades of gray. We've been back to seeing patients in person for months now, many months. Over a year to see some, over 6 months to see all. Sorry, I've lost my place. Here we go. Anxiety is almost the norm among patients. I never have a day, I was going to say rarely, but I never have a full day of patients when I don't address anxiety and depression, which was the case before COVID. I know and I understand. But I have one colleague who's been in practice for over a decade who estimates that we've prescribed more psych meds and referred more people to therapists in this past year than we would have in 5 years otherwise. That's my baseline in medicine now. Cancer screenings were deferred through COVID time. Annuals didn't happen. Patients didn't think much of it on this one annual. But I'll tell you, I've seen some pretty advanced cancer cases in the last few months. I'm likely to see 5 of my patients die of cancer in the next 6 months. A fair bit of that might have been different if it hadn't been for the year they weren't seen. We've had a nice reprieve over the summer here in the Upper Valley, as you all know, but the Delta variant is ramping things up again. I just looked at the maps of case count comparisons, case count change rate from just a month ago, from July 1st to August 1st. And it blares red across the US. I would have put it up if I had the technological skills. Nobody in healthcare is surprised. I don't know exactly what things will look like in 3 months, or 6 months, or 2 years. But I think they will never be imbued with the same sense of downright fear that was the backdrop to my first year of practice. I've now got 800 patients to call my own. I've walked with these folks through, hopefully, the hardest 18 months of medicine the world will see in my lifetime. I've gone through it also with 16 colleagues, now 18 colleagues, who have taken me under their wing and taught me to be a PCP and how to juggle what is, I would agree, an impossible load, even without the added challenges of COVID. My patients, my colleagues, I can't leave them now. I can't leave behind the ways that this entry to practice, both in general in this wonderful, wonderful setting, I just adore APD, and specifically in COVID time, the ways that all of that has shaped me. So the one thing that has become clear about the future to me through this year is this. I think I'm a PCP for life. Thanks.